Hi, I'm Kaylee Whalen, a Guatemalan, Puerto Rican-American, transgender, autistic advocate and travel vlogger. And I'm here in Guatemala to talk about the often colonial tropes that underlie a lot of the tourist industry and how to be a better ally to Indigenous people while traveling by decolonizing your travel. So stay tuned. So I've been traveling and recording videos in Guatemala for the last few months, and I've been here kind of trying to learn more about my roots. And this comes into conflict sometimes with trying to honor Indigenous heritage and not travel in a colonial way. So I believe we need to think about ways in which our travel can sometimes negatively impact Indigenous communities and reinforce colonialism. I'm going to be heavily inspired in this video by reading I Rigoberta Menchu, which is a testimonial written by a Quiche, that is a Maya Quiche tribe woman who advocated for the Indigenous peoples of Guatemala and peasants as a member of the Committee for Peasant Unity. So Rigoberta Menchu, her testimonial told the story. It's not an autobiography. You can't read it that way. It's a combination of many people's stories from the many Indigenous tribes. And in addition to her, I want to lift up Ecuadorian Guatemalan travel writer Bonnie Amor, who I'll quote heavily in this video, as well as the awesome team behind the Instagram channel Decolonizing Travel. These folks have really made me think critically about the colonial nature often of travel, and at the same time why a lot of Indigenous and other people of color feel displaced and travel or feel like they're traveling in their own culture because of feeling displaced. So this lack of roots is something that Bell Hooks has written about, and Bonnie Amor has written about as well. So quoting Bonnie Amor and Bell Hooks, in Belonging, cultural critic Bell Hooks connects this lack of a relationship with home and race. Again and again as I travel around, I am stunned by how many citizens in our nation feel lost, feel bereft of a sense of direction, feel as though they cannot see where our journeys lead, that they cannot know where they are going. What she calls a wilderness of spirit can be linked to much of the white supremacist terrorism that only seems to be on the rise. Many folks feel no sense of place in the United States. So that's from Bonnie Amor and Bell Hooks. And I relate to this as someone fighting white supremacy, as someone trying to learn more about Indigenous and people of color around the world to be a better activist. I'm also struck by my lack of a sense of place as someone from an immigrant family, as someone who's Guatemalan-American who didn't get to visit this country most of my life because of the Guatemalan Civil War, which I'll talk about. So if you do a quick Google search about the Maya peoples and Guatemala, you're going to almost exclusively find videos about ancient Maya culture, especially videos about the classic period of monumental temple building that occurred from about 250 to 900 AD. This is most famous with the ruins of Tikal in the Beten jungle, and the mysteries over what happened to the abandonment of Tikal has led to this narrative of the disappearance of the Mayas, the lost Maya civilizations. If you do find a video that goes beyond the classic period, you're likely going to only learn about Maya civilizations up through the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish, with almost every amount of content glossing over the last 500 years, almost as if Maya peoples ceased to exist after Spanish colonization, despite the fact that 44% of Guatemala's population is indigenous and about 42% of Guatemala's population specifically is Mayan. And most of the rest of Guatemalan peoples have some mixed indigenous blood. So why does travel content not talk about the Maya people of today? Why does travel content not talk about the Guatemalan Civil War, where over 200,000 civilians were murdered or disappeared, a majority of which were Maya indigenous peoples? Well, I think a lot of travel content plays into this white colonial fantasy of rediscovering Maya civilizations. They love to sell all-inclusive package tours to Tikal, where someone can discover these ancient ruins and learn about the disappearance of the Mayas. And then maybe you'll visit an indigenous village and gawk at the Maya people of today, almost as if you're an explorer discovering them, like the Spanish conquistadors for the first time. Now, often these all-inclusive packages put you in resorts, spas, exclusive luxury hotels, with almost 80% of the profits going back into the global north and imperial countries rather than Guatemala or indigenous communities here. In addition, these all-inclusive luxury packages put a strain on water resources and natural resources traditionally used by indigenous peoples, and are often on stolen land, which was initially colonized and stolen by the Spanish, later by the Guatemalan elites, and then later by American companies such as the United Fruit Company, today known as Chiquita Brands. Travelers who book these luxury, all-inclusive resorts or cruise ships rarely step outside of these cruise ships or hotels. And when they do, they're generally only experiencing and interacting with locals in almost zoo-like or museum-like encounters where they can gawk and take photos. Rarely are they mixing and learning and having conversations. And tourists bring with them their own myths and assumptions about these uncivilized people, or to use the language of neoliberal capitalism, developing countries. Rarely, if ever, do they learn about the political struggles of indigenous peoples today, such as land back efforts and ongoing struggles here in Guatemala against oppressive working conditions, such as on plantations known as fincas, and environmental damage from Western industry and industrialized agriculture. However, a recent trend where people believe they're giving back but may actually be doing more harm than good is known as voluntourism. So vacations based on volunteering in local communities, such as helping to build housing or teach English. And these often reinforce a white savior complex, which make tourists feel better about themselves while failing to center the needs of the marginalized people they're supposedly helping. You can book volunteer vacations here in Guatemala where you'll pay a travel company to teach a few English classes to Maya peoples, then return home feeling you've made a difference in the world. Meanwhile, you're lining the pockets of non-indigenous foreign travel companies that are preying on this white savior complex. And the tourists teaching English, for example, to Maya peoples are forgetting or reinforcing hundreds of years where indigenous peoples were forced to assimilate by learning English and Western culture while being taught to relinquish their own cultures. Another form of more ethical tourism that many people look to these days is ecotourism. Ecotourism can be a force for good in the world, especially if it is operated for and by indigenous people and actually preserves and protects indigenous land. Here, Maya peoples were forced to work on the banana, coffee, sugarcane, and cotton plantations on fincas, plantations, first as slaves, then when the Spanish crown abolished slavery of indigenous peoples here in Guatemala, slavery essentially continued under a different name. So now, eco-tourist companies operate tours on some of these plantations, these fincas, and you see them marketed as eco-resorts, greenwashing their ugly history while continuing to rake in money from stolen land. One related travel trend is the marketing of the noble savage colonialist trope. That's the idea that by observing indigenous peoples, a tourist can learn how to live more simply, more at peace with nature. They can feel inspired by how tranquil and loving these indigenous peoples are. This kind of language is ubiquitous in how people talk about travel, especially among liberals, self-styled hippies, and do-gooder backpackers who exploit and co-opt indigenous peoples and their cultures to facilitate their own spiritual journeys. You've seen this at yoga resorts and trendy hostels catering to this do-gooder type. And honestly, I was recently co-working at a hostel which honestly reinforces some of these tropes. The Selena in Atitlan. Right now I'm at the Selena hostel in Antigua. And I was having a conversation with my friend also at the Selena Atitlan. And she mentioned how when she came to Atitlan, she saw Maya women washing their clothes in the lake. And she felt a sense of peace and described to me how it felt like paradise, how she wished she could live as simply as these Maya peoples. Honestly, she was a well-meaning person. She's a fellow person of color from the United States, but her ignorance about the struggles of the Maya peoples made me want to sit down with her and having an in-depth conversation to understand and talk about decolonizing travel and some of these tropes, such as the noble savage. In fact, my conversation with my peer helped inspire this very video because it was a nuanced conversation, and her and I had many things in common. Both of us felt a deep dissatisfaction with our life in the United States and found joy in traveling full-time. And both of us wanted to find a healthier way to live than the oppressive capitalist cultures in the United States where we came from. And both of us, as people of color, felt a shared feeling of displacement from our own cultures as a result of white supremacy. And this is an incredibly valuable point I want to make. White supremacy causes many people to use travel as a temporary escape from feelings of alienation, a chance to soul search, while preventing us from discovering and attacking the roots of our feelings of displacement, which is white supremacy and colonialism itself. And this includes travelers of color. And here I want to include two quotes from Ecuadorian Guatemalan travel writer Bonnie Amor. Wanderlust is often a condition of lacking roots. White supremacy has created a crisis of identity for settlers who have little connection to the lands they are on or the communities they are a part of. Those people Bonnie Amor describes lacking roots include people forced to migrate because of forced indigenous displacement, or so-called Indian removal, the transatlantic slave trade, war, climate crisis, and more recently, neoliberal colonialism. All of these things cause countless people to feel we lack roots, and travel is often marketed as a panacea for finding your roots, while we fail to look at the systems of oppression that cause the initial and often violent displacement from our roots. To grab another quote from Bonnie Amor's article, as Faith Adiel, author of Meeting Faith, The Forest Journals of a Black Buddhist Nun, often says, No one travels more than people of color, whether for work or through displacement or through forced migration. Black, Indigenous, and people of color must go the distance to navigate a global white supremacist culture, often without even having to leave our countries. Given all these macroscopic forces of oppression, including capitalism and colonialism, it's difficult to find a solution to decolonizing your travel and honoring and supporting Indigenous peoples while traveling. I'd be lying if I said I had this figured out. So I'm going to try to give some advice, and I'm going to frame it in a similar way to how the Instagram account Decolonizing Travel has, where I'm going to tell a story about my travels and then try to rewrite that narrative in a way that decolonizes that travel story. I want to share a story of one of my first travel experiences, which was visiting my grandparents in Guatemala as a young child, both 2 trips, both before I was 10 years old. And these were both before the end of the Guatemalan Civil War in 1996, which very much influenced my understanding of Guatemala at the time. I grew up in a mostly white suburb in Washington, D.C., to a Guatemalan-American and Puerto Rican mother and a white father. And to my knowledge, I'd really never interacted with people of Indigenous heritage before my trips to Guatemala. Most of my memories of the trips are in brief, unconnected snippets. But nevertheless, those trips left a deep and lasting impression on me, especially because it was one of the first times my eyes started to open to a lot of the privilege I carried in this world and my family carried. From our first arrival in Guatemala City, I witnessed economic, racial, and class disparities that had practically been unimaginable in the suburbs I grew up in. Never before had I seen this row upon row of houses that were honestly in states of disrepair, houses cloaked in a dense fog of diesel fumes and pollution from the city. I'd really never seen homeless people, many of whom were disabled, panhandling for coins or $1 American on the side of the street. And I'd certainly never been escorted everywhere by an armed guard with an automatic rifle, while being told that I shouldn't wander away because I might be kidnapped or robbed by dangerous guerrillas. And I'm going to pause here to reframe this, because those people in those houses were people who'd been exploited for centuries and couldn't afford a modern house because of the exploitation of the colonizers, the Spanish, and later the bourgeois and elite Latinos. I also need to reframe this dangerous guerrilla myth of the Guatemalan Civil War, as 94% of the human rights abuses during the Civil War were by government forces and paramilitary right-wing forces supported by the United States of America. And the United States of America had in fact sparked this war when they engineered a coup in 1954 to protect companies in Guatemala, including the United Fruit Company, Chiquita Brands, from land reforms meant to help peasants and indigenous peoples of Guatemala. On these journeys with my family, when we traveled outside Guatemala City, we did so in a private chartered bus, instead of the buses that are retrofitted American school buses that are these diesel belching chicken buses that Guatemala is known for, because that's what Guatemalans often can afford and are marketed from the United States companies as secondhand public transit. And our first bus stop was in Antigua here, the former colonial capital of Central America. And this was the first time I kind of went out into the city, went shopping. I was there with some friends of the family, who I'll refer to as cousins, because they basically are. And I remember trying to go shopping and asking how much something costs in my basic Spanish. And then my cousins then cut in and argued with the shopkeeper, saying that they were charging me more because I was a gringa. And this was also a rude awakening, because having grown up considering myself Guatemalan, I realized at this point that I was being treated differently because of my lighter skin, because of my limited Spanish, and because my American clothes, which pretty much marked me as a colonizer or foreigner or gringa. Today, I understand that I was becoming aware of colonialism and privilege. But at the time, I primarily felt angry that I was being treated differently and that I was being charged more than a local. I failed to realize my privilege in that moment. One of my next snippets of memory was visiting the Guatemalan highlands, the traditional place of the Maya people, known now as Huehuetenango, where my grandparents had built a house. Their house, which I've talked about in other videos, yes, my grandfather designed it and hired local Maya peoples with fair wages to help them build it. But this house was modern, with a giant satellite dish out front, modern plumbing and electricity, and acres of fruit trees, which my grandfather had paid for from wages he'd earned as a factory worker in the United States. In stark contrast to this modern house was the Mayan village next door. That was their closest neighbors. And we visited this a few times. And my grandparents had generally good relations, but at the time, I really saw these people as other. I really saw them as less civilized and as backwards, because I didn't understand that their houses, these houses made of packed clay, wood, and thatched roofs, were the way that had worked for them to live with the land and the environment for thousands of years. I didn't understand their customs or their traditions. I just didn't think or research. And I thought of them then as uncivilized. And now, coming to Guatemala, I've made an intentional effort to learn about the Maya peoples. And I went back to Huehuetenango and the Guatemalan highlands known as the Los Cuchumatanes Mountains. And I made sure to hire a guide who was indigenous to tell me more about the indigenous peoples of that area. So one of my final memories from my trips to Guatemala was going to the jungles of Petén to see, yes, the classic Mayan ruins of Tikal. And on the way there, we were taking a speedboat. And I remember looking at the jungle on one side of the boat, the rainforest, as you will, and it was full of beautiful chattering birds and monkeys swinging from the vines, and we saw a tarantula there. You know, it was alive. And then on the other side of the river, it was black, burnt tree stumps. It was desolate, yellow grasses poking up between slash and burn deforestation. And there were cattle grazing on this grass. And I thought, what is wrong with these Guatemalan people? What is wrong that they burn these beautiful forests? And I was an environmentalist, and this hurt me to see this. But what I didn't think about the time, and what I look back now, is I was thinking of Guatemalan people as backwards or uncivilized for having done this. But now I realize the reason there were cattle grazing there and there was slash and burn deforestation is because of colonialism. This was not the way the Maya peoples had, yes, they had cleared some forests, but this kind of absolute wanton destruction and the capitalist consumerism that underlie the need for beef to, fuel fast food American restaurants like McDonald's. This is colonialism. This is not a Guatemalan thing. This is the result of hundreds of years of Spanish and American colonialism. And that, again, is a lesson I can look back at now to tie together the need to do environmental advocacy in a way that honors and respects indigenous sovereignty and indigenous knowledge. Given all these macroscopic forces, these systems of oppression, including capitalism that I've talked about, there's no one-size-fits-all solution for doing travel in a way that decolonizes travel and honors indigenous heritage and supports indigenous communities. I'd be lying if I said I had this all figured out. And again, I'm not indigenous, and listen to indigenous people first. So treat indigenous people when you're traveling like whole people, not some exotic other. Realize they have agency over their lives. Ask for consent before you take photos. And you need to interact. You can't just passively absorb culture from a distance. You need to actively engage in learning and speaking with and educating yourself and not expecting an indigenous person to do all that work for you. Throw out words like third world, uncivilized, or developing. Realize that many of these places you're traveling to had incredibly developed civilizations before they were colonized. Those civilizations toppled by disease, war, genocide. And that this term developing is very much a neoliberal capitalist term enforced by institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which requires nations to pay back massive loans, which generally benefit Western capitalists looking to exploit and develop in order to better extract resources and labor from these countries. If you're one of these people, and this would include myself, trying to discover your roots, trying to maybe rethink how you live, maybe you're on a spiritual journey, don't expect an indigenous person to facilitate that journey for you. And don't exotify or treat an indigenous person like this noble savage trope that I've discussed, that somehow they're gonna teach you how to live better. You have to do that work on your own. That said, if there are traditional guides, storytellers, compensate them. Help them out. Listen to their stories and learn about the oppression and the struggles of their peoples and how you can advocate on their behalf. I've talked about ecotourism. Look for ecotourism opportunities that lift up and help indigenous communities. Look at where you're staying. Did your hotel displace a traditional community or an ecological area that was supported and supported indigenous communities? Don't stay there. And recognize your privilege at all times. Each of us carries privilege in the world, even if we're LGBTQ, people of color, transgender, autistic. I have to examine and check my own privilege, someone with colonizer, Latino background, as coming here in a place where much of the people are indigenous and have been exploited by Latinos. So thank you for joining me. Take a moment to leave a comment. Maybe you have thoughts of your own, something to share. Now, please like and subscribe. If you can, hit that notification bell to get notified of future episodes. I try to release every other week, but it's a bit irregular because of travel. I'm going to Belize tomorrow. And if you can financially support me on Patreon, it would help this channel so much. And you can do that at patreon.com/Kaylee Whalen. So thanks to all my patrons and everyone who supports me. And bye for now.